Hello everyone, I'm sure most of you have heard that Roe got aborted. Doctors Roberts, Thomas, Alito, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett all performed this very late-term procedure. They removed an ill-conceived clump of words which was erroneously believed to somehow be part of the Constitution because, as DNA results have revealed, the 14th Amendment is not the father. Dr. Thomas in particular has expressed an interest in aborting Obergefell v. Hodges, which shouldn't be too difficult as it's not nearly as late term, though his interest in Lawrence v. Texas is quite controversial despite being conceived so recently. Controversy is not deterring Dr. Thomas, however, as he's also expressed interest in an even later term procedure on Griswold v. Connecticut, though his fellow colleagues have cautioned him on being a tad too hasty, and I suggest he perhaps might be poking the bear a bit. Joking aside, though, it's really official. Roe v. Wade is overturned after 50 years of being the so-called law. Roe v. Wade was one of the most blatantly partisan, ideological decisions in the Supreme Court's history, and they did the right thing by striking it down. Despite Justice Thomas getting most of the attention for reasons I hinted at, thanks to poking the bear again and his concurring opinion, which I'll get to later, it was Justice Alito that wrote the majority opinion. Like the leaked draft opinion, his main arguments that Roe was bad precedent, in part because the right to an abortion was not deeply rooted in the nation's history, quote-unquote. A phrase that also appeared in the draft ruling, not surprisingly, which itself was precedent from the 1997 Washington v. Glucksberg decision, which ruled that assisted suicide was not protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment because, again, it wasn't deeply rooted in America's history according to that court at the time, and therefore couldn't be a constitutional right. Now, some historians have criticized this when it appeared in the draft leak, arguing that abortion was legal in most of the American colonies and throughout most states in America's early republic until what was called the quickening, which was the first trimester of pregnancy until early on in the second trimester, when the woman can finally start to feel the baby kick, and that abortion didn't start to become heavily restricted until around the early 1800s. Now, while these historians leave out is that abortions past quickening were almost entirely illegal during this time because the quickening was when it was believed life and understood that life began. Now, even the Roe v. Wade decision, as flawed as it was, used viability as a standard for when abortions can and cannot be potentially banned or restricted. Now, though advances in technology have pushed viability to being much earlier than in 1973, the abortion laws in most European countries today follow a similar standard. Abortions generally legal throughout the first trimester and perhaps early on in the second, but generally illegal past that point, for the most part. Both before and after abortion became more restricted in America in the early 1800s, there were few, if any, federal abortion laws, making Alito partially correct and these historians partially incorrect. Of course, there was a cultural consensus that life began at quickening at the time. There was a lack of federal laws or court rulings, which codified abortion as an absolute right on par with freedom of speech or religion or the press. Now, until Roe, abortion was understood to be a state issue as per the 10th Amendment, and that's precisely what this ruling, as I predicted and as the draft leak indicated, would do. It returned abortion to the state level as is constitutionally appropriate. There was never a constitutional right to abortion, and unless and until a constitutional amendment says otherwise, there never will be. Now, neither Congress, the President, Supreme Court, or anyone else have any constitutional authority whatsoever to codify or ban abortion on the federal level, regardless of what shenanigans they try to pull or make happen. Now, many critics argue this ruling was improper because it was motivated supposedly by religion and not sound law, but riddle me this. If Thomas and company were motivated by religion, truly were, why didn't they issue a broader, more sweeping ruling outright banning the practice instead of just bringing it back to the states? There are some pro-choice libertarians that actually agree with this view. Granted, I'm a pro-life rather than a pro-choice libertarian, but I still think it's important enough to bring up. Still not convinced? The notorious RG herself, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, argued that Roe was flawed. Granted, her reasons were different from Alito's, but still crucial. Ginsburg argued that Roe was too broad, sweeping, and that it may have undermined the momentum that was already occurring toward legalization. In her words, quote, "My criticism of Roe is that it seemed to have stopped the momentum on the side of change. Now, this doesn't mean RGB would have joined Alito and Thomas in striking down Roe if she was still alive to rule on this, because while I have a policy of not speaking ill of the dead, the cold hard truth is she's one of the most blatantly partisan justices of all time. She had the chance to retire when Obama was president, but gambled on Hillary getting elected in 2016, only to really have that bite her in the ass. Roe versus Wade was overturned in part because it was a flawed ruling, but also because the pro-choice side, as I pointed out in my draft opinion three-parter, went way too far by advocating for taxpayer-funded abortion on demand through all 9 months of pregnancy, and in some cases even shortly after birth, as Ralph Northam famously advocated for it. Now, I'm not going to retread that old ground too much here, but I'm going to say that if the standard would have stayed at safe, legal, and rare, then perhaps Roe would still be in place. Roe being overturned doesn't mean that this is over. No, far from it. This ruling has, just as I expected, pushed America one step closer to civil war. For those of you that think I'm being hyperbolic, there was a flood of riots all over the country over this, which thankfully aren't as bad as the George Floyd riots of the summer of 2020, but have plenty of opportunity to get worse, unfortunately. One such riot, where rioters attempted to storm the state capital of Arizona, was particularly bad. Unironically, worse than January 6th, which the media and establishment politicians want to treat like it's our generation's Battle of Fort Sumter or something. And there's also the assassination attempt against Justice Kavanaugh, which you think would be treated as kind of a big deal, but isn't for reasons I don't even need to say at this point. Of course, I'll go into detail about that in another video. That will probably be a New Tech exclusive, because I'm going to argue that the establishment is deliberately trying to provoke a civil war, and spoiler alert, abortion's just one means of many they're going to try and use to accomplish this. Now, what I'll say for now is that the Dobbs decision is having a similar effect to the Dred Scott decision made a few years before the Civil War, and that it's fanning the flames of civil strife. A lot of people have very little understanding of what this ruling actually means, or rather what it would mean, as I pointed out in my draft opinion three-parter. One of the main misunderstandings is that it could lead to them going after gay marriage, interracial marriage, contraception, and etc. And Justice Thomas directly bringing up that the court should reconsider Griswold versus Connecticut, Lawrence v. Texas, and Obergefell v. Hodges, and his concurring opinion, as I stated earlier, really poked the bear, and I sincerely wish he did not make that statement. Of course, since he made that statement, he let that genie out of the bottle. There's no going back now. While Obergefell v. Hodges getting overturned is likely, because it rests on some of the same flawed premises as Roe, and because of the backlash against the LGBT movement, thanks to the excess, as I pointed out in my first ever New Tech exclusive, which I'll link in the description. I again ask why government should be involved in marriage at all, and hope that if Obergefell was overturned, that a separation of marriage and state is what would be the result. I have no issue with gay marriage, but have similar yet different thoughts on that ruling as RGB has on the Roe ruling. I don't want any marriage to be recognized federally or even on the state level. I just want government out of the picture for marriages, gay, straight, or whatever. But I think the broad sweeping ruling that has little constitutional basis may have done more harm to gay rights than good, because it provides a convenient target. Oh, I know, how dare I have nuance, right? But, I'm far less, as for the Griswold ruling, I'm far less concerned about it being overturned because, well, no state is going to ban contraception, and states with anti-contraception laws already on the books will probably strike them down very quickly. Lawrence being overturned, on the other hand, could potentially be disastrous for liberty due to certain states overcorrecting the degeneracy of the far left on certain key issues. Now, bear in mind, this is just Thomas's opinion, while the other justices in favor of the overturn have had a far more narrow scope. Now, Roe and Obergefell are flawed, but Griswold and Lawrence were rulings which frankly should have been framed as Fourth and Ninth Amendment issues due to them being legitimate privacy issues, and the fact that it was the Ninth, not the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment, under the flawed legal premise of substantive due process, which were intended to deal with actual unenumerated rights. It really baffles me why the 14th Amendment is used as a poor substitute for the 9th Amendment in so many cases. Of course, Justice Thomas isn't entirely wrong, but again, isn't entirely right either. But who knows? These justices sometimes may surprise us in ways that are positive and negative. If those cases get relitigated, we'll just have to wait and see. But back to abortion. Once again, overturning Roe is the right decision from a constitutional standpoint. But abortion, like slavery before it, is a profound evil that contradicts the principles of a free and just society and demonstrates a profound limitation in the Constitution itself. Abortion, like slavery, was considered a constitutional practice, albeit not on the federal level, but on the state level. This injustice was rectified with the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to former slaves and free blacks, and the 15th Amendment, which granted black men the right to vote. Unfortunately, we needed another civil rights movement 100 years later to enforce these Reconstruction Amendments. That's the key word, enforce. But today, these equal constitutional rights to non-whites as well as women are codified and mostly enforced, at least when the government actually obeys the Constitution. Of course, unfortunately, the government doesn't obey the Constitution very often. At best, it seems to view it as an inconvenience. At worst, an obstacle to overcome. But we have a government that's really now equally tyrannical to all except the woke, though I guess going into detail on that further is perhaps a topic for another day. Despite the fact that I'm not merely content to leave abortion to the states indefinitely, I do of course view abortion going back to the states as an important step forward. The Supreme Court's federalization of abortion in Roe helped normalize a barbaric act that has no place in a just society. By abortions, for those of you who will no doubt bring it up, I mean elective or non-medically necessary. Of course, on the state level, we can at least minimize the damage of this being a normal practice while doing the necessary work of changing the evil, decadent culture that's allowed this cancer to metastasize to the extent it has, while perhaps someday introducing a constitutional amendment enumerating the unborn child's natural right to life. This won't happen overnight. It will likely not happen in the lifetimes of anyone currently watching this video, as it took 50 years to overturn Roe v. Wade. And if it takes another 50 years for such an amendment, then assuming I'm still alive by that time, I'll be over 86 years old, and any future children I have will most likely themselves be well into adulthood and may have children of their own. It's also possible, however, that this change may change much more quickly than any of us could imagine, as, frankly, this decade, the 2020s, is one of those decades where centuries of change could happen merely in 10 years. Roe is gone, but the culture of violence and decadence that made it possible is very much alive and must be addressed if the abortions are to no longer be commonplace. We must also address the economic and social concerns which lead to women feeling abortions their only option. That if they don't make this choice, that they can't have their careers or be successful in life, and reform the adoption system to make it easier and cheaper for prospective parents to adopt children. These and many other reforms are necessary to ensure that we become a more humane society, that we advance rather than simply, once again, as we did with Roe, go backwards.